So, welcome everyone. And we get a little competition today. There's some work going on outside the door here. So you might hear what is that called? A cable saw? Yeah. So why don't we begin with the word of prayer? Lord God, we give you thanks for this glorious fall day, for the blessings that will come to us and the blessings of being here together now. We pray that this may be a time of wisdom and understanding, that you will fill our hearts with the truth that can truly set us free and bring us closer to the life that is abundant. All this we ask in the name of our risen Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. All righty, so just a reminder of how we're doing this, since we're both in person and live, is feel free to ask any questions and I will repeat them just in case the microphone doesn't pick you up. And we will go till about 9:45. So this morning we're looking at a lectionary reading from Mark's Gospel. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He is continuing his journey there. And it's interesting, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus only goes to Jerusalem once. In John's Gospel, as we've said many times, it's very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus goes back and forth from Galilee to Jerusalem, and it's most likely that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are correct, that Jesus only went to Jerusalem once, and that was when he arrived there on Palm Sunday. Because if you think about it, his opposition was centered in Jerusalem. That's where the Pharisees were. That's where the high priest was. That's where the Romans were. And so it's most likely that they are correct. So as he's going on his way to Jerusalem, he passes through Jericho. And he has an encounter with a man by the name of Bartimaeus. And because of his disability, we refer to him as blind Bartimaeus. So without further ado, let's go in and hear the story.
And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. Mark 11.
Oops, I didn't realize it would go automatically to the next chapter. All right, so there you have the story of blind Bartimaeus. Questions, comments, conundrums. Anything strike you about this passage?
What struck me when I was reading it again was the very last line of verse 52, and followed him on his way. And the story, of course, in Mark's chronology, is the next thing he's on his way to Jerusalem. So, what is fascinating is you almost can picture Bartimaeus possibly following Jesus into Jerusalem.
Yeah, and you know, Tom, as you were talking, I had this sort of weird thought. Yes, so Bartimaeus follows Jesus on the way. And we know that Jericho isn't far from Jerusalem. Okay, Jerusalem's up in the Judean hills. Jericho is down in the Jordan Valley near the Sea of Galilee. So there's a winding road that you have to go up to get to Jerusalem. Gold star to anybody who can tell me where that winding road plays or is significant elsewhere in the Gospels.
Blindness on the road to Jericho.
Say again, please.
When they were traveling from Jerusalem and didn't recognize Jesus on the winding road to Jericho.
Interesting. I'll have to give that some thought as to where that is in the scriptures. I'm not recalling Jesus on the road to Jericho and someone not recognizing him. The road actually plays a significant role in the story of the Good Samaritan. That's where the Samaritan is traveling when he is attacked, because remember, the priest is on his way up to Jerusalem to serve in the temple, as the Levite is. So it's a very dangerous road at that time, notorious for having a lot of robbers. But yes, so Tom, you're right. Bartimaeus follows Jesus. And that actually just helped me answer a question that I was pondering, which is this. We know in the Gospels, Jesus heals lots of people. Most of them, though, aren't named. Just as, he healed 10 lepers, or he healed the man beside the pool of Bethesda. There are very few instances where a person is named. Okay, I can think of a few. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he's named. That isn't a surprise because we know that Jesus had a personal friendship with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So that's not a surprise. Can you think of any other people Jesus healed in scriptures who is named?
Oh, the one who, isn't it the fellow who's by the pool and waiting to be carried in?
No,
is he?
I don't believe the man beside the pool of Bethesda is named. The one that comes to mind is Jairus' daughter. Jesus raises her from the dead. And that's probably because, he was an important person in the synagogue. So very few instances where we know the name of the person who Jesus heals. We know Bartimaeus, and probably because most of them, after the healing took place, they went their separate ways. But Bartimaeus followed Jesus. And so as they're going along, and he's probably with Jesus for a while, the implication is that Jesus or the author of Mark's gospel became aware of his name. And it's also possible that in this situation, Jesus may have asked him his name, and that just isn't recorded in the story. But, names are important.
Oh, yes, it's interesting. I looked up the etymology of Bartimaeus.
Bartimaeus, okay. What does Bartimaeus mean?
Well, of course, the first part of that, if we take the name literally apart, is B-A-R, which means
Barb's son.
And it means
son of
honorable son.
Honorable son of Timaeus?
Yes, the honorable son.
Okay, honorable son. Yep. So, a few minutes ago, I said your comment, Tom, put this kind of weird image in my mind. And I wondered if Bartimaeus was blind from birth or if he became blind at some point in his life, either through an illness or an accident. But if he was blind from birth, I had this image of them walking on the way to Jerusalem and Bartimaeus saying, "What's that?" "Oh, that's a tree, Bartimaeus." And what do you call that thing over here? Because if he hasn't seen anything before, but we don't know. So what do you think about the reaction of the crowd to what's going on here? Are they supportive? of Bartimaeus, this poor man who's suffering, who has to sit along the side of the road and beg. Are they supportive of him in his desire to be healed?
Well, there was a,
Go ahead, Leslie. Yep.
They rebuked him, so they told him to be quiet.
Yeah, they told him, they rebuked him.
Yeah.
You know, they rebuke him and they order him to be silent. Why do you think they show this definite lack of sympathy for him? Yeah, Don.
We tend to say, well, you're not equal to me, go away, you're not important. Don't bother us, don't get in our way. We're concerned about this people.
Oh, you know, it's so they're focused on themselves.
yes.
Yeah. So they want quality time with Jesus. You know, it's similar to what happened when parents were bringing their children to Jesus. And do the disciples encourage them? No. And Jesus says, you know, exactly. Jesus says, do not hinder them, for to such belong the kingdom of heaven. And the reason why is, back then children were looked down upon. And beyond that, the disciples, I think, were a little miffed because these kids were getting in the way of their quality time with Jesus. So, yeah, I think we have a little bit of that going on here with the people in the crowd.
What about, like you were saying, Sunday in the sermon, they would have assumed that Bartimaeus, like, did something, or the parents did, like, some big
That's
wrong
right.
thing.
Yes,
And we, like, deserve to be blind.
That's right.
Right?
that's right.
So they might have thought, like,
Yep.
you're not good enough.
That's right. So back then, the attitude was, as I mentioned in the sermon about Job Sunday, is that if something bad happened to you, it was because God was punishing you. Because back then, their theology was pretty simple, and we would say simplistic, that bad things don't happen to good people. So the fact that Bartimaeus is blind means that in their minds, he was a bad person and God was punishing him. Of course, that raises the question, what about somebody who's born blind? They haven't had an opportunity to do anything bad. And there's a story in the Gospels, I believe it's John's Gospel, where the Pharisees bring a man to Jesus and they say to him, Jesus, is this man blind from birth because he sinned or because his parents sinned? And Jesus replies essentially, no, that's not how it works. And he said, this man is blind, and now behold what the glory of God is going to do to him. There's another story where they asked Jesus about this apparently well-known tragedy back then, where there was this Tower Siloam, that collapses and kills, I think, 8 or 9 people. And they ask, were these people sinners? And Jesus says, do you think that they were any worse sinners than you or others? And so Jesus clearly did not share this attitude that if a tragedy befell you, it was because you were a bad person or you deserved it. Okay? Now, I will say that in some cases, bad things happen because we're getting what we deserve. If I am in a national park, let's say I'm out in Yosemite, and there's a sign that says, stay back, cliff. And I ignore that sign and I say, you know what, I want to get a peek over the edge of that cliff. And I get there and the cliff collapses and I fall to my death. Okay, yeah. Now that's saying stupid me, doesn't mean that God caused that to happen or wanted that to happen. So yes, the people here are not sympathetic to Bartimaeus because their attitude is, Bartimaeus, you're blind because you're being punished by God. So just sit there and accept your lot in life.
I think also, one of the commentaries I said that Bartimaeus had committed a grave social faux pas. He had shouted at a rabbi which you were really not supposed to do. He was
Okay.
supposed to be, he had not followed the proper decorum.
Yep. So Andy, welcome, Harry. Andy, you just made a cameo.
I did.
Yeah, you walked in front of my. So everybody, there we go.
Actually make it official.
Oh my goodness, yes. You know, I can't tell you how wonderful it feels to be doing this in person and actually being able to see you rather than peering at a screen and saying, I wonder who's hiding back there. So thank you all for being here and for wearing masks. I'm not wearing one, I'm keeping my distance. So we're continuing to look at Bartimaeus, and Tom just raised the point that Bartimaeus may have been rebuked by the people in the crowd because he committed a faux pas, which is that he shouts at Jesus, and Jesus is a rabbi, and that was considered rude and unacceptable. So that may be part of it as well, but I think primarily it's because they see him as being punished by God, and their attitude is just sit there and accept your lot in life. So I look at this story. Yes, Don.
I think Tom's point is significant today as well as back then, in the fact that people who do something that's socially unacceptable. We have people who stand up and shout in the church. That's happened many, many times. They be quiet, be quiet. And in colonial days, there were a number of instances where there were situations that came up because of the philosophy and the theology being discussed, where it incensed the people, and they stood up, and others said this is inappropriate and tried to suppress them.
Yeah.
Right or wrong.
Right. So yes, there is this general human tendency that we have expectations about how you behave, how you act, and if somebody steps out of that expectation, out of the norm, there is a tendency among the group to bring the person back into acceptable behavior. So I looked at this story and it got me thinking, are there different kinds of blindness? And I don't mean causes of blindness. For example, a person can be born blind. I think if you don't get enough oxygen when you're being born, sometimes that can lead to blindness. I know that there's blindness that is caused by diabetes. So there are different causes of blindness, but I'm talking about different types of blindness. Yes.
There's a blindness from what I guess I would call a lack of open-mindedness. We grow up in a culture, in a heritage, in an outlook, a perspective, or we learn something and that's it. And somebody who questions that will defend it blindly, rather if somebody brings a scientific fact. And I guess the COVID is a good example.
The what?
The COVID.
Oh, COVID.
There are people who will not get the shot, and they have this set of particular things that they believe in. There is no scientific value to it, but they will be blind to the scientific because they're fearful of losing the other.
The prophets had a saying, they would sometimes refer to the people of Israel and say, you have eyes to see but do not see, and ears to hear but do not hear. And on your point about being blind to certain things, I think is absolutely true. Some would say COVID is an example. I read an article in the Globe last Saturday that I found fascinating. And it was an interview with a nurse out in Oregon who has just been put on unpaid leave because she refuses to get a vaccination. Now, one of the things I found interesting about this is that she was very articulate, and a lot of the political stuff that we're hearing when it comes to this debate. One of the things she pointed out was that she did not want to get a vaccine vaccine shot because I think it's called the mRNA is new technology, and we don't know what the long-term consequences of this technology is going to be. And I thought, oh, okay. And she also made a good point. There are some people who are saying that if you do not get a shot, a vaccination shot, you should not, and there's a limited number of intensive care beds, that because you have made the decision not to get a shot, you should not get that bed over somebody else who has been, say, in a car accident and is seriously, their life is in danger. And she made the point that while there might seem to be some logic to that, in other words, you've made a decision that has resulted in your serious life-threatening health situation. Her point was, we don't say to people who smoke and end up with lung cancer that you can't have a hospital bed. We don't say to people who are morbidly obese and have a heart attack, I'm sorry, you can't have a bed in ICU. So her point was, there's a double standard here if you're saying that. And I thought, she's making a lot of sense. But the one place where I said, okay, I'm sorry, you've got a blind spot here. Okay, she doesn't want the vaccinations that use the new RNA technology. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine uses the old standard adaptation of the virus that has been disabled. So that has been going on, that technology has been going on for decades. So everything she says is true, but she can get the Johnson & Johnson, So I think that one of the things that fascinates me about this story is that Jesus isn't just healing one person. He's healing a whole bunch of people. He's healing Bartimaeus of his physical blindness. But do you see how he's healing all the people in the crowd of their spiritual blindness? And I think that's another kind of blindness. We all have our spiritual blindness. The people in the crowd, they were spiritually blind when they looked at Bartimaeus. They were seeing him as this bad person who was being punished by God. And Jesus makes it very clear that that's not the case. And so what does Jesus do after they rebuke Bartimaeus and order him to be silent? What does Jesus do?
He offers help.
Pardon me?
He offers help to Bartimaeus.
He does, but how does he do that?
He says, your faith has made you whole.
Say again, please, Harry?
Your faith has made you whole.
Yeah, that's another fascinating part of the story is at the very end, Jesus says, go, your faith has made you well or whole. Jesus doesn't take credit for the miracle. He gives the credit to Bartimaeus. And you think about it. How are the people looking at Bartimaeus? As a bad person. And if you're a bad person, does that mean that your faith is weak or maybe you're not a good person of faith? And Jesus says just the opposite. He says, your faith has made you well. So that's definitely contradicting what the people in the crowd are thinking. As Bartimaeus is a bad person who has weak faith or no faith. Jesus is giving the credit. But when Jesus actually does the physical healing, how does that happen? Look at verse 49. So the 48 ends with Bartimaeus refusing to be silent. And he shouts out even more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And then, verse 49, and Jesus stopped and said, call him. Do you notice what Jesus is doing here?
Got the crowd involved.
He's getting the crowd involved, that's right. And he's making them interact with Bartimaeus. He's making them call him. You think about it. Jesus, yeah, he could have called him himself. He said, Bartimaeus, don't pay any attention to them. Come over here. Or Jesus could have walked his way through the crowd over to Bartimaeus. But he doesn't do that. He says to the people in the crowd who think that Bartimaeus is this bad person, call him. You bring him here. And notice how they respond. Yeah, take heart. Get up, he is calling you. So they're beginning to think, wow, something's going on here. Jesus is healing or attempting to heal their spiritual blindness. And so this is a passage that says to me, what are my spiritual blind spots? Can you think of some examples of some spiritual blind spots?
Equality.
Equality.
Anything to do.
Equality, okay.
Jesus keeps stressing that as he does here.
Yeah.
Everyone is equal.
Okay. So in a sense, a lot of what's going on in our country today has to do with a kind of spiritual blindness that I think would be of great concern to Jesus.
That spiritual blindness, when you get to certain, I'm going to say religious groups and elements in this country, is a strong belief in where they are, which is what I referenced before, and an unwillingness to look openly for change and open-mindedness that they have blinders on.
That's right. Again, because when we're talking about spiritual blindness, we're talking more about the way we think rather than actual seeing things. Although if you think a certain way, it's going to color, no pun intended, the way you actually look at things. So, for example, somebody can do something, and a person who has a spiritual blind spot will attribute a bad motive to why they're doing something when that's just not the case. It made me think of this story about an elderly woman, poorly dressed, kind of a street person, and every day she's walking along the beach and she's picking things up here and there. And the people that lived along the beach would see her and they just thought she was up to no good. You know, she was finding things that people had lost in the sand and was taking them for herself, things like that. And turns out that she was picking up, when she found it, pieces of glass so children wouldn't cut their feet while they were on the beach. But again, that spiritual blindness can color the way you look at somebody and what they're doing. I can think of another kind of spiritual blindness. Actually, I can think of lots of different kinds of spiritual blindness, and that's why you'll have to come on Sunday to hear the sermon. But here's one example. In a family that has a member with an addiction, okay? In order for the person to continue with their addiction, and we'll just use alcohol since it's the one that is most common. In order for the person to be an alcoholic, others have to enable that person. They make excuses, they cover up, they deny that there's actually a problem. Even the alcoholic will have a spiritual blindness. Oh, I don't have a drinking problem. You know, I just do it to relax. And, you know, if you had the boss that I had, you drink a little too. And so, you know, I just drink when I'm happy, or I drink when I'm sad, or I drink when I'm stressed out. So people in the family they'll have a blind spot to the problem. They won't address it, okay? For a long time, we had a spiritual blindness when it came to what was going on and what is going on with our environment. And still there's some spiritual blindness to this. People are saying, oh, well, climate may be changing, but there's no proof that it's related to human activity. Do you remember, oh my gosh, I can't remember his name. He was the Interior Secretary under Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, short name.
Yes, I want to say it begins with, no, I want to say it was Ickles or something like that.
Even shorter than that.
Oh,
Yeah.
gosh, yeah. I remember he came to Boston.
Yep.
I remember he shiny bald head. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the reason why I just thought of him is, and I'll think of his name eventually, but he was a conservative evangelical Christian. And he was very controversial because his policies were very anti-environmental. He was the Secretary of the Interior, and his policies were to open up all the lands and allow clear cutting and strip mining and all of this. And he was very controversial. And one of the reasons why he was so anti-environment is because, I remember reading this article, he believed that we were in the final days. As a conservative evangelical Christian, he believed that the time was very short when Jesus was going to come back. And so his attitude was, if this world's going to come to an end shortly, we might as well use it up while we still have the opportunity. That's basically his attitude. That's a spiritual blindness, okay? And we all have our spiritual blind spots. And so...
One good reason to travel.
Is what?
One good reason to travel.
Oh, one good reason to travel. Yeah, I agree with you, Leslie. Yes, that's right. I have found, as I've traveled various places around the world, that there are very different cultures, but we're all the same when you come right down to it. But it allows me to have a more open mind toward differences. I'll give you a spiritual blind spot that got addressed for me a number of years ago. We did a Lenten series for the youth ministry on world religions. And so we had Jack Romo, Sheila Romo's husband, came and talked about Judaism and the Passover. We had somebody who was Muslim came and spoke to them. I think this was a couple that somebody in the church knew. We had a Buddhist monk come and speak to them as well. And then we took them to a Hindu temple. Do you know that there's a Hindu temple in Andover? Yep. Beautiful, beautiful temple. You wouldn't even know it's there. So as you're driving on 495 going north and you get to the exit for Route 28, if you take that exit, immediately at the end of the off-ramp, the temple is right there. Okay? So there was some famous festival that they celebrate every year, and they had this little icon, and they came out and they bathed it and they poured milk over it and made offerings. And I don't remember the name of the festival, but afterwards we were talking to some of the Hindu priests and the members of the congregation, and I learned something that I didn't know. Let me ask you this question. Would you say that Hinduism is polytheistic, that they have multiple gods?
No.
Well, yes and no, okay?
They're vehicles to get to God.
Exactly. In some respects, they are like the Catholic Church has all these saints, and the saints are pathways to God. That's why in the Catholic Church they'll pray to saints. because they believe that saints can go and say, hey, God, Andy's down there and he's got a problem, and I'm the patron saint of this or that, and can you help him out? In Hinduism, what I learned is that there is one God, but all of these different manifestations of that one God represent different qualities of God. So I forget the name, but there's a Hindu god who is the god of destruction. And then there's the god of life, god of birth, things like that. And so what I began to realize is that in Hinduism, it would be, the best way to put it in Christian terms is it would be as if Jesus came multiple times and was incarnated multiple times, and each time was a little different and represented different qualities of God. So I thought all my life Hinduism is polytheistic, and it turns out it isn't. Okay, so I had a spiritual blind spot, and because it was polytheistic, or I thought it was polytheistic, I thought, well, you know, it's not a it's more pagan than faithful. I've changed my attitude toward Hinduism. Doesn't mean I'm going to be a Hindu. Doesn't mean that I believe everything in the Hindu faith, but my thinking and my way of looking at Hindus and Hinduism is different now because of that experience, and only because I had a connection with them. And let me ask you this question. How does that relate to this story? All that we're talking about. Actually visiting different places, seeing different people, experiencing different cultures, talking to people who are different. How does that play out here in terms of the spiritual blindness?
Well, I actually give the crowd a bit of credit that they didn't just say like,
Okay.
you know, I know it was Jesus, but not everybody that came to see Jesus, most of them just thought like, it was just like having like, you know, a rock star come to town
Right.
or whatever. Like,
Yep.
let's just go see this famous guy, because
Right.
nothing ever happens in our little town, you know,
Right.
let's go see him.
Yeah, so it was a big deal that he was coming through town, and people just wanted to see.
They actually were like, oh, like he wants to talk to him. But like, hey, go talk to him. He wants to talk to you. They weren't just like, hey, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
So, right, so the fact that they quickly turn and say, take heart.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there were probably some people that were saying, I'm out of here. He's going to spend some time with that blind beggar. You know, we have to be careful we don't generalize it. But the clear thrust of the story is that people began to change their attitudes. And why? Because Jesus made them interact with Bartimaeus. So if Jesus had just gone over to Bartimaeus and said, hey, Bartimaeus, don't pay any attention to them. I know what's really going on here, and you're not a bad guy, and I'm going to heal you. Jesus makes the people in the crowd interact with Bartimaeus. And that's what allows them to begin to look at him differently. And it's what allows Jesus to begin to heal their spiritual blindness. And that's really, spiritual blindness is all about changing attitudes so that relationships can change. And
sorry.
no, go ahead.
Just taking more on a literal level, like a lot of people still today feel very uncomfortable around anybody that has that's a handicap or whatever.
Yes.
Challenge, I guess, is
Right.
term in any way. They
Yeah.
don't want to have anything to do with a blind person, a deaf person, somebody, autistic child. They're just like, get away from them.
Yes, so I agree with you, Leslie, that even today people have an uncomfortableness, or some people have an uncomfortableness when they're around someone who is different. Either they have a disability, or whatever the politically correct term is. And as you were talking, it made me think about an experience I had when I was a student minister. I can remember, it was my second year of seminary, a little Methodist church, and I went to see this woman, mother, and she had a son who, I'm not sure what the clinical diagnosis was, whether he was just severely depressed or whether he was schizophrenic. I think he was schizophrenic. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he had attempted suicide. And I can remember sitting in the room when he came in unexpectedly and how uncomfortable I was. And as a pastor to be, I'm sitting and thinking, I know I'm supposed to reach out and try to connect with this person, but also being very uncomfortable. And so, yes, we tend to be, go ahead.
Spot, or is that confidence, or
My reaction?
like your reaction, or what Leslie's talking about?
Yeah.
Is that a result of being blind to it? I mean, people are aware of people in wheelchairs or people with schizophrenia. So are they blind to it, or are they, or are they just unsure of how to respond to it?
I think the question, are they blind to it, or they just don't know how to respond to it? I think it's one of those one size doesn't fit all. Just as we were talking about, there are different kinds of blindness in terms of physical blindness. The person would be blind because of a lack of oxygen when they're born. They can be blind because of an accident. They can be blind because of diabetes. So I think that in this situation, some people have an attitude that a person in a wheelchair is less than. I give you another kind of spiritual blindness that I can relate to, and it's not so much today, but when I was growing up, being adopted was not a good thing. And I can remember when a kid in the neighborhood said to me, my mother doesn't think I should play with you. And I said, why? And he said, because you're adopted. And so the attitude was, well, if you're adopted, it means that your parents were of questionable morals. And so obviously you must be tainted as well. I think I saw a hand over here. Yes, Don.
I think one of the things here is a group dynamics versus the individual dynamics. Jesus is addressing the group in his saying, call him to me. And it's comfortable for people to hide in the group without their individual feelings. And I think this, you mentioned the conservative religions and things. Our religion, theirs, the Hindu or anyone, we're part of a group as well as individuals. And our reactions are influenced by both positions.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think of how he comes to a blind person through the group, but he focuses on the individual. And almost all of Jesus' teachings masterfully addresses the group and focuses on the individual, because religion is individual.
So, if I'm understanding you, one thing that you said was that groups, I think you used the word or the phrase, hide in the group. And I think that's absolutely true. As you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind is January 6th.
Yeah.
Okay. If you separated all of those people, or let me put it this way, do you think that many of these people, most of these people would have done what they did individually?
Yeah.
But when they came together as a group, they fed off of each other, and it was one of those situations where 1 + 1 = 7.
It's the leading effect.
Yep, and so, I think that's that can definitely contribute to spiritual blindness. Is you get in a group, and that's the other thing with spiritual blindness is you tend to only associate with people who see things the way you see them. Yep, I didn't know.
Yeah, they also had a leader, what's the word I'm trying to come up with, that coordinated all their thinking and to motivate them to actually go forward with action.
Mm-hmm.
So who contributed to the blindness?
Right.
Yep.
Yep.
Whereas these groups have met other times, but there was no action because they didn't have that leader motivating them to take action.
Yeah. So there had to have been somebody that they looked up to who lit the match, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And again, Jesus heals Bartimaeus' physical blindness, but he also heals the spiritual blindness of some of the people in the crowd. And he does that by making them interact with Bartimaeus. And the question that this story asks us is, what are your spiritual blind spots? What are my spiritual blind spots? And allowing our faith and our journey of faith to bring us to a realization and to heal those spiritual blind spots. Great. So I hadn't thought about this in terms of the sermon. Do you remember the Civil War in Biafra? It was back in the 60s. And I forget, Biafra was a part of some larger country over in Africa. And there was a civil war. And because of the civil war, there was a huge, massive starvation of the Biafran people. So international aid organizations responded, and one of them was the Red Cross. And they had a center where people could send donations. So in this Red Cross center, they receive a box. They open the box, and there are strips of white cloth that can be used for bandages. And, nice enough, but there was also a note in the box. And it said something to the effect that we are followers of Jesus. We weren't always faithful followers of him, but we've decided to follow him now. And so please use these to help the people in Biafra. We will not need them. We will not need our KKK robes anymore. So they took their KK robes, cut them in strips, and sent the cloth to help blacks in Africa. Isn't that a great story? It is.
Coming around.
Yeah. So what that says to me is, yes, Jesus can heal our spiritual blindness. And when our spiritual blindness and our spiritual blind spots are healed, it makes life better. And it brings us closer together with each other. So I thank you all for being here. And for those who may join us online, watching down the road, ask God's blessing upon you as well.
Thank you.
We're